Yeah, it's a real delight to be introduced by Father Mario. I mentioned to him yesterday that, we spend so much of our lives in ordained ministry in planting seeds. We keep talking about we're just planting seeds, and then someone else will water and Christ will make it grow. But every once in a while, we get to reap the fruits, and that's what I'm doing today, reaping the fruits of the seeds I planted 7 years ago. So I've been asked to begin with a prayer, and so I thought I would pray the prayer for this conference, which some have been praying for quite a while now. It's sort of the prayer that will unite us throughout these days. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Almighty and all-loving God, in the beginning you created them, male and female, as a sign of the covenant with your people. The covenant which you would seal with the most precious blood of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. We thank you for this sublime gift that is the life-giving one-flesh union of husband and wife. And we ask you for the grace always to cherish, esteem, and foster it as you intended, the foundational good of human society and the icon of the union between Christ and his church. As we celebrate these 50 years of the encyclical Humanae Vitae's articulation of the Church's timeless teaching, help us to be wise, bold, and charitable messengers of this good news, so that a culture of love, life, and marriage may flourish in our land. Open the minds and hearts of those who are far away from this truth. Heal the broken lives of those who have been hurt by its rejection, and strengthen those who commit themselves to living it by inspiring others to do the same, so that we may have peace with one another and happiness with you now in this life, and know its perfect fulfillment forever in the life that is to come. We ask this through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, head and bridegroom of the Church, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Our Lady of Guadalupe, St. John Paul II, Blessed Paul VI. I have the honor of giving this opening keynote for our Clergy Day, but the very fact that you are here attending this conference for clergy on the teaching of Humanae Vitae tells me that you're probably among those who least need to be here. So thank you. But if you're here because was at the urging or challenge of a brother priest or a deacon or a couple that you know, and maybe you were hesitant to attend, but then decided to anyway, thank you too for being here. And for those of you who have been committed to promoting this foundational teaching of our human flourishing, a really huge thank you. I have to recognize that you all are just as qualified as I am to be giving this talk. You have a lot of wisdom to share, a lot of experience to draw from, and your own deep reflections and learning. So I really see myself here today speaking to you more as a brother priest rather than bishop to priests and deacons, and seeking with you to glorify God by enlivening his people with the full truth of the gospel. So I would like to just share some of my own reflections and what I've learned from my own experience. A lot of it will probably not be new to you, but I hope I'll be able to give some fresh perspective on these timeless issues that we are dealing with. For me, the teaching of Humanae Vitae is an issue that I've been very committed to for my entire priesthood. And I'm encouraged by my fellow priests, such as you and my brother bishops, who are courageous in advancing this teaching. In my own life, I first became aware of and interested in the Church's teaching in this area of what Humanae Vitae calls responsible parenthood when I first entered the seminary. Now, that was back in the mid-'70s. I see some gray heads here, so you're probably around at that time, and even if you weren't, you remember it was right after the promulgation of Humanae Vitae, and we were still in those Humanae Vitae wars at the time. And even if you weren't even alive then, I'm sure you're aware of the retreat of the clergy pursuant to the fallout after Humanae Vitae. As you know, there were even some bishops who were adamantly opposed to the teachings. And even those priests who were sincere and good-hearted felt dumbfounded. I remember older priests sharing this with me. They just had no response to their people's complaints, concerns, and anxieties. They didn't know how to respond, and so they just fell silent. I find this most unfortunate because there were some resources available with which to respond. Now, I was just speaking with Father Luke before my talk. He'll go more into this. The Billings method of natural family planning was around, although Father Luke tells me it wasn't quite as well known as I thought it was, but it was around. And we had also scientific evidence about the harmful effects of contraception. And so there were resources around. But more importantly is our very concept of the purpose for which God created us, male and female, and gave us a sexuality. Of course, in the 50 years since then, the famous 1968, we have lots and lots more on which to rely in both areas. A variety of very accurate natural methods to track fertility, and lots more scientific data on the damage that especially hormonal contraceptives do to women, and increasingly awareness of its harm to the environment as well. For myself, I've always trusted in the Church's wisdom, so I never really had a big problem with the Church's teaching. It made sense to me. Then when I studied theology, I attended a talk by the Billings themselves, and that all the more clarified for me the correctness of the Church's teaching, because I understood even more how the teaching is confirmed by biology, and how everything about the woman is for conceiving a new life, getting that new life conceived, and then helping that new life come to birth, nurturing that new life after the birth. Everything about the woman and her whole system is geared toward life, and the whole idea of sexual complementarity is geared toward life. I later had more personal contact with couples using natural family planning, especially through my involvement with Marriage Encounter. I was quite involved with them for many years. And I saw the good that NFP was doing to improve marriages and deepen communication, and helping couples live according to God's plan for their marriage. One thing I liked about the ME couples that I worked with, and this was my own personal experience on the weekends that I presented, is how they would share their practice of natural family planning in their talks. There'd always be one of the talks on their sexual relationship. So it was very kind of open and frank sharing, and they would speak about it, but they wouldn't like make dogmatic pronouncements or condemn people who disagreed. They were just simply sharing what that experience was in their marriage and the benefits it had for them. And so they bore witness to the goodness of NFP and their personal experience, and in doing that, they attracted other couples to learn about it. So the experience of our society over these last 50 years has only confirmed for me, and I'm sure for you too, the wisdom of the Church all the more. The new normal of supposed sexual liberation has brought with it a massive breakdown of the family with the corresponding huge social costs involved. And you're all well aware of them. I don't need to go through the litany. Many of you see them every day. Exponentially higher rates of incarceration, crime, dropping out of school, kids caught in cycles of poverty and violence, and so much more. We're now living in a fatherless society, and we have 50 years of lived experience, and if that weren't enough, we also have reams and reams of social science data to confirm for us all of the social ills that stem from fatherlessness, family breakdown. This is the price our society pays for sex without consequence. Or at least they would have us believe that it's without consequence. But the consequences are huge and very dire. As you're all well aware, I'm sure, as well, we got here really by separating the procreative end of conjugal love from its unitive end. It's indicative of what is commonly referred to as a contraceptive mentality, a mentality that separates the procreative purpose out from the sexual act. So it reduces the sexual act to something that is done simply for pleasure. Thus, its proper place is no longer exclusively within marriage, and all means are allowable for avoiding the consequences of an undesired pregnancy, even literally resorting to murder. Abortion is simply a backup for failed contraception. Pope Paul VI, of course, saw all of this coming back in 1968, and you're all well aware of the famous prophetic passage in Humanae Vitae. It is quoted often and referred to very often, but for the sake of review, let me quote it once again. Consider how easily this course of action could open up this course use of contraception, open wide the way for marital infidelity and for a general lowering of moral standards. Not much experience is needed to be fully aware of human weakness and to understand that human beings, and especially the young who are so exposed to temptation, need incentives to keep the moral law, and it is an evil thing to make it easy for them to break that law. Another effect that gives cause for alarm is that a man who grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods may forget the reverence due to a woman, and disregarding her physical and emotional equilibrium, reduce her to being a mere instrument for the satisfaction of his own desires, no longer considering her as his partner, whom he should surround with care and affection. The last 5 decades, as we know, has more than verified Pope Paul VI's prophetic words, because indeed we are facing some issues now that not even he could have imagined back then, when you consider all the inroads that gender ideology has made in all sectors of our society. And as for that point about the man reducing the woman to being a mere instrument for the satisfaction of his own desires, no longer considering her as his partner, whom he should surround with care and affection, think Me Too movement. So that's the bad news. Some say before people are open to hearing the good news, they first have to experience the bad news. And many people have. But we are ordained to proclaim the good news. And we do have good news to share. But how do we go about it? Well, what I'm going to say might surprise you, but I believe the antidote to the poison that our culture is force-feeding us is to form our people in the spirituality of stewardship. Yes, stewardship. But stewardship understood in the fullest sense. While some of you may be surprised to hear me say that, no priest of San Francisco would. Because I preach about stewardship in every parish that I visit, I'm striving hard to promote this teaching all throughout the Archdiocese. I find, though, that we still, even though this has been around a long time, we still have a lot of education to do, because many people still see it as a form of fundraising, or a euphemism, really, for fundraising. Or perhaps responsible use and administration of resources. Those better schooled in it understand it has to do with time, talent, and treasure. But even more than that, stewardship acknowledges everything as a gift. Not just time, talent, and treasure, but everything, spiritual as well as material. Spiritual too. Our faith, the truths of our faith that we're called to hand on to the successive generations. The liturgy is a given. It's not something we create or can recreate in our own image. And everything material, the environment. So I love Pope Francis's strong image in Laudato Si of calling the environment our common home. We understand this as the context in which we work out our salvation through interacting in society and exercising the dominion over the earth that God gave us at the beginning. So all that God has given us. And that includes our bodies. And it is really all right there at the beginning. Stewardship of our bodies and stewardship of temporal goods. You already know, probably by memory, the passage from Genesis, but let me read it. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created man in his image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." First, he creates them male and female, and then he gives them dominion over the earth. The former has to do with our sexuality, the latter with the material things of this world, represented on the practical level by money. So there you have it, sex and money, right at the beginning. It reminds me of what a story a bishop once told me of a priest in his diocese. The bishop was receiving complaints from the priest's parishioners because, so the parishioners said, all he would preach about was sex and money. One Sunday was sex, the next Sunday was money, back and forth and back and forth. So the bishop finally called the priest into his office and asked him, "How come all you preach about is sex and money?" His response, "Because that's all there is. It's all about sex and money." Well, maybe he had a point, but I'm not encouraging you to do the same thing now. But maybe he had a point, because isn't that what captures the attention in the headlines and people's interest? Sex and money, especially when it involves scandals, sex scandals and money scandals, and nothing's better than when a scandal involves both. But I think he also had a point because these are two areas of life that are a very intimate part of who we are. So how we use these gifts from God will affect everything else about us as individuals and as society as a whole. And I think it's quite evident in our postmodern Western culture how the culture has become very corrupt in both of these areas. Since there's such a deep part of who we are, if there is corruption there, it will contaminate everything else in our lives and when widespread in all of society. On the other hand, if we are rightly ordered in relating to others with effective maturity, the term we use in priestly formation, right? Rightly ordered with our effective maturity relating to others, and rightly ordered in the use of the temporal goods God has entrusted to us, then we have a good opportunity to rightly order everything else in society. But if that's disordered, there's no way we can get everything else rightly ordered. God's gifts are meant to be used for God's purposes, for the sake of our happiness. And this includes stewardship of our bodies. If we think of how the body is designed, it's pretty clear that it's made for complementarity for the sake of new life. And so we call marriage a communion of life and love. Marriage is a communion, and it's for life and love. Now, we Catholics have this novel idea that the purpose of sex is reproduction, one of the two primary ends of marriage, right? Or two ends of marriage. As someone once said, we have to make this announcement now. Newsflash, sex makes babies. People kind of lost this idea. I think it's pretty self-evident that this is what it was designed for by God. So if we mess with that, it's going to get us into a lot of trouble. This is the contraceptive mentality. It involves introducing something artificial right within the most intimate act possible between two human beings, when they're saying with their body, "I'm giving you entirely of myself." People even speak about protecting yourself in the very act by which a couple says, with the language of the body, "I give myself completely to you." It's the most intimate physical act possible between two human beings, and they even speak about putting a barrier in place. Now this to me sounds very schizophrenic. If everything is possible to use sex for pleasure and avoid the consequences, we have now come to the point, especially with developments in science and technology, where one can do anything possible to create a new life in whatever the way they want to. I'll never forget once, this was back when I was living in Rome, so mind you, this was like 20 years ago. I was walking down a street and I passed by the window of what I realized was a feminist bookstore. Now this is kind of ironic for a couple reasons. One, it wasn't that far from St. Peter's. If you're familiar with Rome, it's the bridge that crosses the Tiber that goes to the end of the Via Conciliazione. It's the bridge between where the Castel Sant'Angelo is and the North American College. It's at the end of the Corso Vittorio Emanuele. So it's right over the bridge down the Conciliazione, there's St. Peter's. So there's this feminist bookstore. And I see in the window, proudly displayed, a book with the title, Self-Insemination. And I thought, well, that is really ironic, because when I was in college back in the 70s, women who were with the Spirit of Times would ask, how can I do it without getting pregnant? And now what women with the Spirit of Times ask is, how can I get pregnant without doing it? So something has really run afoul here. It's so sad. It's tragic. Children have become a commodity, used as a means to an end. And it has become especially brazen with increasing recourse to surrogate motherhood. It's alarming how common the stories have become, like one I remember from a few years ago. This particular case I remember reading about was from Canada. Well, it involved a surrogate mother in Canada. She was carrying the biological child of another couple, should I call them the contract couple? It was his seed and her egg, but the surrogate mother was carrying the child. You've probably heard of similar stories. They discovered that the child had Down syndrome. The couple didn't want to keep the child, but the surrogate mother did. The couple was insisting that she have an abortion, but she resisted, saying that she would raise the child herself if they would just give some support. The couple said, no, this wasn't part of the deal. So the surrogate mother was eventually forced to have the abortion. So, what is our society coming to? All of this is the result of this very deep-seated misunderstanding of the human person and the meaning of our human sexuality. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist, or perhaps more to the point, a genius in philosophy or sociology, to figure out the key to correcting all of this. The key is hard, but not complicated. It's that now rarely heard word, even though it's not technically literally 4 letters, it's a 4-letter word to some, unknown to others. It's chastity. Chastity properly understood in the full sense of the term. Unfortunately, chastity nowadays, for those who have heard of it, has come to carry a very negative meaning, the suppression of the sexual appetite for the sake of some kind of oppressive, outmoded, puritanical belief system. You're probably familiar with H.L. Mencken's famous definition of Puritanism, the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy. But if the only 2 options are Puritanism understood in this sense on the one hand, and sexual libertinism on the other, then we're doomed, because both are oppressive and both lead to unhappiness. Neither results in human flourishing. Happily, we know that those aren't the only 2 options. Happily, there's the option of chastity, properly understood. I would like here to refer to St. John Paul II's explanation of chastity in the landmark book he wrote when he was the Archbishop of Krakow, Love and Responsibility, which I really see as sort of the blueprint for what he developed into his theology of the body. He says there that chastity consists in quickness to affirm the value of the person in every situation, and in raising to the personal level all reactions to the value of the body and sex. It is a spiritual disposition which cannot be achieved without spiritual effort, and ultimately exists for the sake of happiness. Its function, he says, is to free love from utilitarian attitudes, the idea of using another person for a means to one's own end. He says these tendencies lie deep within the soul. And he has a very provocative image where he says how these tendencies are hatched deep within the soul, and we must dig deep in there and root them out. Chastity then only makes sense in association with the virtue of love. And not love in the sense when we're talking to our young people about the future. When we encourage our young people to be chaste, it's not simply a matter of bearing with it now and abstaining until marriage, but it's forming them into persons capable of loving here and now, according to what love really means. We must then inform our emotions with reason. If we don't, we'll be stuck with the two unpleasant and oppressive extremes as our only options. This is a message our young women especially need to hear, because in the situation of promiscuity, it's inevitably the woman who ends up more deeply wounded. Society keeps trying to pretend that's not the case and suppressing that. Young women need to appreciate how awesome is the gift that God has given them. They have the gift of being able to conceive a new human life right within their body, a human life with an immortal soul. What an awesome gift God gave them. They have to learn to appreciate this gift. Unfortunately, they have to learn it nowadays. It's instinctual to them. But they have to learn to appreciate it and understand how sad it is to misuse it. They should never throw away this greatest gift just to give some boy a fleeting thrill. And even if it's a thrill for her and she thinks she's in love, still it's a lowering of who we are called to be. It's keeping us stuck in that mode of just using the other person and allowing oneself to be used. It's chastity that makes love possible. Our young people need to understand this for the sake of their own happiness. Without it, they will never be happy. I really think the measure of their capacity for happiness is if they have the virtue to be faithful in marriage for their whole lives, they're going to have the capacity for happiness in life. Everything tells them otherwise, but they must be disabused of the myth so they don't have to learn the hard way. I firmly believe that an excellent entree for us to do this is to teach young people the principles of natural family planning. And for those young people at the right maturity level, also teach them about the horrible side effects of artificial contraception, especially the hormonal contraceptives. Now, this is biology, i.e. science. They're supposed to like science and believe in science. So let's begin with science, because these are facts. There's no room for disputes. There's no room for opinions. But just explaining how NFP works, and this was my own experience, and I can clearly remember going back to that talk I heard by the Billings. Just by explaining how it works, which means explaining in a positive way how the reproductive system works, we will naturally lead them to a sense of wonder at it all and an appreciation of how God has created us, male and female. We will then have them predisposed to learning about why God created us, male and female. They will be ready to hear how NFP shows greater respect to the woman, no terrible health risks and side effects, and it's also a method that requires the participation of both, and therefore engenders in the man a greater respect for the woman. It's not the attitude that so many men seem to have, it's up to her not to get pregnant. What kind of an attitude is that for a man to have toward his spouse or the woman he claims to love? Do young women even think of this? I don't know, maybe you know from your pastoral experience. I wonder, do they even think of this? And we know how NFP also deepens communication, has many other benefits. Obviously, these are things I've learned from NFP couples. Obviously, I didn't learn these myself, my own direct experience, but they tell me, and I'm sure you've heard the same thing, that it even helps them attain greater satisfaction in their sexual relationship. And when you think about it, that actually does make a lot of sense. Perhaps most indicative of all is how low the divorce rate is among those couples who practice natural family planning. And I'm sure you're well aware of this too. I mean, that coupled with regularly attending church together and praying together, the divorce rate among NFP couples is what? It's like below 2%, isn't it? 2 at the most. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever imagined a world in which the divorce rate is 2%? Imagine how much easier your life as a priest would be if 98% of your parishioners came from intact, strong, united families. Imagine those of you who work in tribunals could go back to full-time parish ministry. And you know, it's interesting, the surveys continue to show that high percentages of young people, boys as well as girls, hope someday to get married. It's curious, we've seen an actual decline in people getting married, But the surveys show young people, they still hope to get married. Vast majorities. We can be sure none of them hopes to get divorced, right? So we have an antidote to that. We can learn a lot about God and his will for us from our bodies. It all really fits together quite well. Respect for life leads to respect for God's plan for marriage. Living that plan cannot help but engender a love for God, and therefore a desire for God and for friendship with Christ. Friendship with Christ naturally leads one to seek incorporation as a member of his body. If a couple is living God's plan for their marriage, right at the deepest, most intimate level, they cannot help but be Christ-centered. Responsible parenthood is antithetical to selfishness. And that is why it is the secret key to evangelization. To sum up, NFP is not just a technique, another method for avoiding pregnancy with its own advantages and disadvantages. Rather, NFP is it's an essential part of responsible parenthood, which is a whole spirituality of marriage. It's a spirituality of openness to life, resorting to infertile periods only when the couple truly has grave reasons for doing so, as Blessed Paul VI taught in Humanae Vitae. It's openness to life, therefore openness to the other, and openness to God. It's a spirituality of communion. Again, in the sense of that communication that takes place at the deepest level of the relationship. Communication facilitated by NFP because it keeps the couple in touch with that deepest level of their relationship. It's a spirituality of perseverance, working at keeping one's marriage strong, living by the old adage that if you want your marriage to work, you have to work at your marriage. It's a spirituality of confidence in the truth as revealed by Christ and taught by the church. The teaching of the church is nothing to be embarrassed about. On the contrary, this is the truth. If we have conviction that this is the truth, we will want to share it with others for their own good. Archbishop Chaput, in his typical fashion, put it very well in a pastoral letter he wrote back when he was the Archbishop of Denver. He said, "To be embarrassed by church teaching is to be embarrassed by Christ's teaching." And what is the result? He says, "The irony is that the people who dismissed church teaching in the 1960s soon discovered that they had subverted their own ability to pass anything along to their children." So ultimately, life ends up empty and meaningless. It's like the whole culture contracepts itself out of existence. And it's a spirituality of generosity. Generosity towards each other, towards family, towards community, and the church. It is therefore spirituality of, yes, stewardship, also involved with generosity of time, talent, and treasure. Responsible parenthood, then, is essentially a spirituality of stewardship, of recognizing our bodies, our very sexuality, as a gift from God to be used for God's purposes, because his purposes are for our greatest good. We are stewards of these gifts. And what we call stewardship in the conventional sense, we can also understand as sort of a spirituality of chastity with regard to the passing material things of this world and how we use them, accepting them as gifts from God and using them for his purposes, because his purposes, again, are for our greatest good. Again, it's God's consistency of design, whereby it all fits together. To understand and live God's plan for the human person at this deepest level. When we do that, everything else comes into focus at the other levels as well. You know, I'm struck by how much similarity I see in the challenges of leading and inspiring our people to live responsible parenthood, as taught in Humanae Vitae, that is stewardship of the body, and doing that for stewardship of the temporal blessings. But they go together. As I said, this is how God put his stamp on human creation. Again, male and female, he created them, and then he gave them dominion over the earth. That means that violating that creation, or seeking to undo it and recreating it in our own image, it's a particularly grave offense against God. Remember that both the sin of the Sodomites we read about in Genesis and the sin of defrauding workers of their just wages, we read about in the letter of St. James, are both sins that cry to heaven for vengeance, because they begin monkeying around with how God put his stamp on creation at the very beginning. On the positive side, I'm sure many of you have experienced that your parishioners who live according to the Church's teaching on responsible parenthood are also those who are most generous with time, talent, and treasure. Again, the consistent spirituality, the spirituality of a steward who uses and administers the master's goods in a way that will please him and give him an increase. I'm going then to shift right now to the U.S. Bishop's pastoral letter on stewardship, issued back in the 90s, Stewardship, a Disciple's Response. That letter, too, goes back to the very beginning and teaches that the world, as it says, remains a kind of garden or workshop entrusted to the care of men and women for God's glory and the service of humankind. We have here then the beginning of the Christian vocation, to collaborate with God in the work of creation, the first chapter of Genesis, and in the work of redemption, the third chapter of Genesis, the fall and then the promise of redemption. Since stewardship sees all of creation as gift, the Christian vocation consists in returning to God with increase all that he has given us. As Stewardship, a Disciple's Response says, all temporal and spiritual goods are created by and come from God. That is true of everything human beings have. Spiritual gifts like faith, hope, and love, talents of body and brain, cherished relationships with family and friends, material goods, the achievements of human genius and skill, the world itself. One day, God will require an accounting of the use each person has made of the particular portion of these goods entrusted to him or her. Marriage is a school of self-perfection, as St. John Paul was fond of teaching. That really means accepting the reality of our bodiliness, accepting our spirituality as a gift from God, and then living accordingly, organizing our life around that. Stewardship is likewise a school of self-perfection with regard to a relationship to the passing material things of this world, using them in a way that has consequences for our eternity, as gifts from God to be used for his glory and to help us work out our salvation. This does place demands on us, but not in some sort of a masochistic way. Quite the contrary. As the bishops say in their pastoral letter, to be a Christian disciple is a rewarding way of life, a way of companionship with Jesus, and the practice of stewardship as a part of it is itself a source of deep joy. Those who live this way are happy people who have found the meaning and purpose of living. They are happy because they are grateful. Stewardship is essentially a spirituality of gratitude. How can one cooperate with God's gifts if one is not grateful for them? Without gratitude, happiness is impossible. As that wise bishop I mentioned earlier, that I know is fond of saying, gratitude is the attitude of beatitude. That pretty much sums up what stewardship means. And it's not that we have to put up with hardships in this life in order to be generous and be miserable here so that we can be happy in the hereafter. That was the Marxist criticism of Christianity, wasn't it? Pie in the sky, by and by. But it doesn't work that way. That happiness begins already here and now, because living this way creates within us the capacity for heaven, because it creates within us the capacity for love. Does that sound like what I said about chastity a moment ago? Same thing with regard to the material things of this world. To use them in a way that has positive consequences for our eternity. To use them in a way that makes us capable of love and therefore capable of heaven. This certainly is not the message we hear out in the world. That message is so often directly contrary to the way God has created us to live, because it shuns the cross. This is really the path of the cross, but the cross that leads to that deeper happiness. The message we most often hear out in the so-called world is that the purpose of life is to live for me. It's all for me, not for others. As the bishops say in their pastoral letter, in some ways, it may be harder to be a Christian steward today than at times in the past. Our country's secular dominant culture often contradicts the value of Judeo-Christian tradition. This is a culture in which destructive isms, materialism, relativism, hedonism, individualism, consumerism, exercise seductive, powerful influences. Or to sum it all up with one more ism, and I'm sure you know this well from your ministry, it's all pretty much summed up in narcissism, isn't it? And you've noticed how we're living in a very narcissistic culture. Now, people who are in the business of making money, they know this. They understand the culture, and they know how to market their product or service in the narcissistic culture in which we are living. They study it, they understand it, and they learn how to communicate effectively with it. Just take notice of advertisements. I'm not making a judgment on the businesses themselves. They're entirely legitimate businesses. But they know how to market it, like those billboards. I think they're still around. I know a few years ago they were quite common. That would, for the bank, it would advertise, the Bank of Juan or the Bank of Jessica. It's my bank, right? Or the Army's recruiting slogan, an army of one. So people know whatever business they're in, they know how to advertise to the culture. And then, of course, there is the ubiquitous maxim, believe in yourself. I just can't take it anymore. Everywhere, believe in yourself. I get nauseated. I'm fond of pointing out to young people that if that's their belief, if that's their guiding principle in life, they're starting out on the wrong foot. It's not that they should not trust themselves or not believe in themselves, but if that's their guiding principle, they're starting out on the wrong foot. They have to begin by believing in God. Only by believing in God will they then be able to develop their full potential, spiritual potential especially, and then grow to be the person God created them to be. But we're living in an age when, even though it's an old song, it's still the theme song of this age, I did it my way. So we need to understand the culture and how to communicate with the culture so we can purify the culture, because we are called not to build a world in which I did it my way, but in which we did it God's way. We did it God's way world, recognizing that God is the builder. If God does not do the building, in vain do the builders labor, the psalm says. We have to labor, but we have to allow God to do the labor through us. This is living according to the way that God made us. And to do so is ever more challenging in the world in which we live. As the bishops explain in Stewardship, a Disciple's Response, the contemporary culture has become adverse to the Judeo-Christian values on which it was originally founded. And as they say, Christians are part of this culture, influenced by it in many ways. Well, that means us. We are all influenced to some degree and in some way by the culture in which we're immersed. If we are to cooperate with God in the work of creation and redemption, then we will have to attend to the work of ongoing conversion, of participating with Christ in his self-emptying, embracing the cross. And the deeper we dig and the more intimate we seek to unite ourselves with him, the more costly will that death to self be. But it is worth it. The dehumanizing trends of contemporary society destroy human dignity. We are called to destroy not our dignity or another's dignity, but to destroy our sinfulness and our selfishness. This is the way to attain our basic human vocation that we all have, which is happiness with God. At its root, it is the same basic spirituality in both areas of sex and money, and with the same challenges, living the way God created us to be. Give, 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 and other, other. In a world that persistently shouts at us, take, 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 and me, me, me. And it is by living this way that we can heal and reconcile the world, because it gets to the root of the problem. Yes, this is all ultimately for our happiness, the only path to true and eternal happiness. What then are we to do? How are we to go about the task of calling the culture, and specifically our own people, to destroy the sinfulness and selfishness within them, and to retrieve the beautiful and life-giving values from our Judeo-Christian tradition that built up our civilization in the first place? Well, you all have answers as much as I do, I'm sure. But in addition to, obviously, number one thing to do is attend to doing that ourselves, our own interior work. In addition to that, I'll suggest 4 strategies, which are basically a recap of what I have suggested throughout this talk. This is based on my own personal and pastoral experience and reflection. I'm sure you have many more ideas and maybe fresher ideas. It's been 25 years since I was a pastor of a parish. But some of these things that I learned are still very much a part of me. The first and most obvious thing is to preach about it. We need to preach bold homilies sometimes. And it can be done. I know it can be done. We can do it in a sensitive way, but in a very incisive way as well. One of the most, I hear both good things and complaints about priests, okay? But one of the, and deacons, mainly priests though, when it comes to preaching, that complaints about the preaching. And the problem is, I don't witness it myself, because whenever I'm celebrating Mass, I'm always the one who preaches, right? And if I'm not preaching, it's because another bishop is preaching. Very rarely am I at a Mass where I hear a priest, let alone one of my own priests, give a homily. The few times I've had, the homily's actually been quite good. But I hear these complaints. They're banal, they're superficial, and so forth. And maybe they're just too safe. It reminds me of what some of you may know, my seminary classmate, Father Thomas Loya, who speaks a lot about theology of the body. Actually heard John Paul give the talks at his Wednesday audiences when we were in the seminary together. He says that we're not producing vocations because of our preaching. And we've kind of contracepted our priesthood because we're not reproducing. And he says, we're not reproducing because we practice safe sermon. Need to be bold once in a while in the preaching. Secondly, obviously we need to teach our young people about it. If you are not doing it already, include it in your marriage preparation program, and even if it's not required by your diocese or part of the program for the marriage prep, you can always require it as the people within your parishes. Couples preparing for marriage using the resources that your diocese has. And that would also involve identifying couples you think would be good candidates to teach NFP. The third thing, I spoke about marriage preparation, but you all know as well as I do that when the couple comes knocking on the door of the parish office asking to be married, 90% of their preparation has already been done, if not more so. Their preparation is done in the family and in their schools and faith formation programs. So maybe we need to start teaching this in our schools and our faith formation programs. Even teaching what I said earlier, teaching principles of NFP. It can make a huge difference. I remember back when I was a pastor there about 25 years ago, a young couple came to be married, so I knew the groom's father quite well. We were close friends. I knew the family well. Good, faithful Catholic family. She came from a good Catholic family too. They both went to the local Catholic high school. So this was out in the Imperial Valley. So it's kind of a remote area, but there's a small high school of the diocese there. They had a very popular, revered teacher, Mr. Giacobelli, who would teach his students about NFP. So I always required my couples to do a course of instruction of NFP. So usually there's the hurdle to get over, helping them break down their misconceptions of what it means, try and convince them of the value of it, and so forth. I didn't have to do this with this couple. They already understood the basic concept and were on board with it. It was like a smooth, open road. So let's begin teaching our young people these principles. And fourthly, kind of the point of my whole talk here, form your people in the spirituality of stewardship. You don't even need to speak explicitly about NFP. Just form them to be generous, wise, and responsible stewards. Probably all of you, like I, have known people who have come into the church or back to the church precisely because of her teaching in this area of responsible parenthood. It's ironic, isn't it? The area of church teaching for which we are most despised in society is the one that lands the greatest catch of souls. And I'm not speaking so much numerically as in terms of authentic conversion. The best converts are those who come into the church through this route. It makes sense. Imagine the attitude. Well, if the church is right, after all, about this, maybe the church is right about everything else. Such converts and reverts display a real conviction and enthusiasm for the faith and a zeal to share this good news with others. The whole point of my talk has been to make the case for this as a strategy for the new evangelization, and also to do so by explaining its connection to stewardship, or better yet, by explaining and illustrating how stewardship, understood in the broader sense in which I have presented it, is the all-encompassing way in which we live our Christian spirituality in the world. And it has a particular import in the areas which are most intimate and personal to us, and especially in these two areas of our sexuality and our use of financial resources. Where there is conversion in this area, there is conversion and conviction of the entire person. So that is the surprise, the title of my talk. That is the surprise. To cite just one example, listen to this testimony of a married couple. After 12 years of marriage, we are grateful for the people who have challenged us from the beginning to embrace fully Christ's teachings. They weren't always telling us the things we wanted to hear, but we feel blessed that we were able to work through the initial frustrations of committing to the church. It's difficult to separate ourselves from the demands of the world, but there's a tremendous amount of peace that comes from every decision we make for Christ and His will for us. We can't overstate the powerful impact the lifestyle has had on our marriage and 3 children. What lifestyle do you think they were referring to? The spirituality of responsible parenthood or of stewardship? It's hard to tell, isn't it? The quotation actually comes from Stewardship, a Disciple's Response. I omitted a few words in the quote that would have tipped you off that that's what they were speaking about. To cite completely what they said, as our concept of stewardship continues to evolve after 12 years of marriage, we are grateful for the people who have challenged us. And we feel blessed that we were able to work through the initial frustrations of committing the best portion of our time, talent, and treasure to the church. And it's difficult to separate ourselves from the demands and possessions of the world. Just as Catholic social teaching was the church's response 100 plus years ago to the dehumanizing movements of Marxism on the one hand and the abuses of the Industrial Revolution on the other, so the church's teachings in the area of responsible parenthood are her response to the dehumanizing movements arising from the sexual revolution. Catholic social teaching has been called the church's best kept secret, and for good reason. I would, though, qualify that slightly. I consider Catholic social teaching to be the church's second best kept secret. The best kept secret is her teaching on responsible parenthood and the goodness of NFP as within that spirituality. So let's let that secret out of the bag. A great catch of souls awaits us. Thank you.